He, a solitary tycoon, skeptical about emotions, doubted disinterested love existed. She, a humble housekeeper, felt unworthy of a grand romance. He notices her during his visits to the hotel and falls for her soul. But her insecurity explodes. "Stop, Mark! You can't love me. I'm just a housekeeper. I'm poor. You deserve someone better." The words hit Mark hard. He takes her hand and proposes. "You're everything I've ever looked for. I deserve you. Marry me." Get ready for a twist where an unexpected proposal turns into a scandal. But the strength of their love and the purity of her soul might break down all barriers. Watch this story to the end. You'll be blown away. If you enjoy love stories, romance, subscribe to this channel, leave your comments. We post videos like this every day. Continuing on. Victoria Ramos adjusted her apron over her navy blue uniform and sighed softly as she glanced at the clock on the locker room wall. 8:15 a.m. Another day was beginning at the Grand Plaza Hotel, one of the most luxurious hotels in Chicago. Around her, other employees were getting ready in silence, some still sleepy, others already accustomed to the routine that started before the sun even rose. At 35 years old, Victoria knew every hallway, every suite, and every secret of that place. She had worked there for 8 years, invisible to the guests who paid more in one night than she earned in 3 months. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a simple bun. Her face, free of makeup, revealed delicate features that she never had time to admire in the mirror. To her, it was just another ordinary face, lost in the crowd of people who kept the world of the wealthy running. "Morning, Vicky," greeted Marlene, her supervisor, a 50-year-old woman who had worked at the hotel since it opened. "You're on the 23rd floor today. The presidential suites," Victoria nodded. The 23rd floor was the most demanding, but also the quietest. Few guests could afford those astronomical rates, and those who could rarely appeared during her cleaning hours. It was almost like working alone in a world of marble, crystal, and luxuries that she could never imagine owning. She grabbed her supply cart and headed for the service elevator. On the way, her thoughts flew home, where her grandmother Mercedes was waiting for her with breakfast. At 72 years old, Grandma Mercedes was her only family since her parents died in an accident when Victoria was 17. She had raised her younger siblings, Joey and Marie, alone, who were now studying at university thanks to the sacrifices Victoria made every day. "At least they'll have a better future," she murmured to herself whenever the tiredness threatened to overwhelm her. It was her driving force, her reason for getting up before dawn and working until her feet ached inside her worn shoes. Across town, in a penthouse that occupied the top 2 floors of a skyscraper on Michigan Avenue, Mark Sterling was finishing up reviewing the quarterly financial reports. Even though it was only 6 a.m., he had already been up for 2 hours, a routine he had religiously maintained for over a decade. At 38 years old, Mark had transformed a small family business into an empire that stretched across the United States and was beginning to conquer the international market. Hotels, resorts, casinos, and entertainment centers bore his name and his signature of excellence. He was feared in business, respected by competitors, and courted by Chicago high society. But as he watched the city awaken through the panoramic windows of his office, Mark felt the weight of the loneliness that no amount of money could fill. 3 failed relationships had left him skeptical about love. Women who were interested in his wealth, his influence, his status, but never in him truly. "Mr. Sterling," the voice of Gus, his personal assistant, interrupted his thoughts. "You have the meeting with the Japanese investors at 9. And then you need to inspect the Grand Plaza. Apparently, there have been some complaints about the standard of cleanliness in the presidential suites." Mark frowned. The Grand Plaza was his crown jewel, the hotel that had established his reputation in the luxury market. Any slip-up there could tarnish years of careful image building. "Cancel the 3 o'clock meeting with the marketing team. I want to personally check these complaints," he said, already heading to the closet to choose a suit. "And Gus, don't let the manager know I'm coming. I want to see how things really work when they think I'm not watching." At the Grand Plaza, Victoria was in the middle of her routine when she heard a strange noise coming from Suite 2307. She had just cleaned that room and was sure it was empty. She hesitated for a moment, then knocked gently on the door. "Housekeeping," she announced in a low voice. Silence. Then the sound of something falling. Victoria felt her heart race. It could be a guest who had arrived without her knowing, or worse, it could be someone who shouldn't be there. The hotel's security was tight, but not impossible to bypass. Using her master key, she opened the door carefully. What she saw made her gasp in shock. A man in a dark suit was lying on the floor of the living room, apparently unconscious, with a small pool of blood next to his head. Without hesitation, Victoria ran to him, kneeling beside him. She quickly checked if he was breathing and felt relieved to realize he was alive. The wound seemed superficial, probably caused by the fall. She grabbed some clean towels from her cart and applied gentle pressure to the cut while trying to wake him up.
Sir, can you hear me?"
Mark opened his eyes slowly, feeling a throbbing pain in his temple. His vision was blurred, but he could distinguish the face of a woman leaning over him, her brown eyes full of genuine concern. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. When was the last time someone had looked at him with such disinterested worry? "Don't move," Victoria said softly. "You hit your head. I'm going to call an ambulance." "No," Mark murmured, trying to sit up. The movement made his head spin, but he held onto her arm to steady himself. "No need for an ambulance." "What happened?" Victoria helped him lean against the wall, noticing for the first time the quality of his suit, the expensive watch on his wrist, the natural authority in his posture even injured. He was certainly someone important, perhaps a VIP guest she hadn't been informed was arriving. "I found you here on the floor. Looks like you slipped and hit your head on the edge of the coffee table," she explained, still pressing the towel against the wound. "I'm Victoria from housekeeping. Are you staying in this suite?" Mark watched her for a moment, fascinated by how naturally she was taking care of him, without asking questions about who he was or what he did. Her movements were careful and gentle, her hands work-worn but delicate. There was something about her that reassured him in a way he couldn't explain. "Mark," he said simply, deciding not to reveal who he was yet. And yes, something like that. Victoria kept pressure on the wound as she watched Mark try to compose himself. There was something about him that made her strangely nervous. Maybe it was the way his dark eyes studied her with an intensity she wasn't used to receiving. Most people looked right through her, as if she were part of the furniture, just another functional object in the scenery of their privileged lives. "You need to go to the hospital," she insisted, noting that the bleeding had stopped, but worried about a possible concussion. "I can call a cab, or if you prefer, the hotel has an agreement with a private medical service." Mark shook his head slightly, immediately regretting the movement when a new wave of dizziness hit him. "It's not necessary. I feel better already." A lie. His head was throbbing, but there was something about the genuine concern of this woman that made him want to prolong the moment. When was the last time someone cared about his well-being without knowing who he was? "You don't look good," Victoria insisted, frowning. "At least let me clean that cut better." She got up and went to her cart, returning with the first aid kit she always carried. She knelt again beside him, her work-worn but surprisingly delicate hands carefully cleaning the wound. Mark felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest. How long had it been since anyone had touched him with such disinterested tenderness? "Do you do this often?" he asked, trying to break the tension that he felt growing between them. "Take care of injured guests?" Victoria blushed slightly. "Not exactly. But my grandma always taught me that we should help those who need it, regardless of who they are." She stopped talking abruptly, realizing that maybe she was being too familiar. "Sorry, Mr. Mark, I shouldn't be talking so much. It's just, you seem different from the other guests." "Different how?" Mark found himself genuinely curious about the answer. "More human," Victoria replied without thinking, then was mortified by her audacity. Sorry, I didn't mean that the others aren't. Mark chuckled softly, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "No need to apologize. I think I understand what you mean." He watched her, as she finished taking care of the wound, noticing how her cheeks flushed easily, how her eyes sparkled with a kindness he had forgotten existed. "Can I know your full name?" "Victoria Ramos," she replied, putting away the first aid supplies. "And you?" "Last name?" Mark hesitated. If he said his full name, everything would change. She would know who he was, and that naturalness, that spontaneity would disappear. In its place would come the forced deference, the calculated interest, the respectful distance that everyone kept from him. "Mark Sterling," he said finally, watching her reaction carefully. Victoria stopped moving for a moment, processing the name. Sterling, she knew that name. It couldn't be. Mark Sterling was the owner of the hotel, of the entire hotel chain. His picture occasionally appeared in business magazines that she sometimes saw at the front desk. But that man there, sitting on the floor of a suite with a bandaged forehead, seemed suddenly much more imposing. She began, her voice failing. "The owner of this place," Mark confirmed, seeing the immediate change in her expression. There it was, the realization, the recognition, and inevitably the distance that always followed. "I came to do a surprise inspection. Apparently, there have been complaints about the standard of cleanliness." Victoria felt her stomach sink. The owner of the hotel, and she had talked to him as if he were any guest, had been informal, had even made comments about other guests. But yet, he was there to check complaints about cleanliness, and she was responsible for that floor. "Mr. Sterling," she stood up quickly, smoothing her apron with trembling hands. I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was you. If there's something wrong with my work..." "Victoria." The way he said her name made her stop talking. Mark got up slowly, using the wall for support. "You saved my life, or at least prevented me from lying here until someone found me. You have nothing to apologize for." But Victoria had already recomposed herself, returning to the professional posture she had maintained for 8 years. "Of course, sir. It was just my duty. Would you like me to call someone from management? Or maybe a private doctor?" Mark felt a pang of disappointment at how she had transformed. The warm and caring woman of moments before had disappeared, replaced by the obedient and distant employee. "It was always like this, always." "No," he said, straightening his jacket. "But I need to do some checks in the hotel later today. Maybe you can show me how the cleaning routine works. Since I'm here, I'd like to better understand the procedures." Victoria nodded, although inside she was terrified. The owner of the hotel wanted to follow her work personally. That could only mean she was in serious trouble. Maybe she was about to be fired. "Of course, Mr. Sterling, it would be an honor." Mark perceived the tension in her voice and felt a strange urge to reassure her. "Victoria, you're not in trouble. In fact, from what I've seen so far, the standard of cleanliness seems impeccable." She looked at him in surprise. "Thank you, sir." "Mark," he said impulsively. "When we're working together, you can call me Mark." Victoria looked even more surprised, but nodded. "As you wish. Mark." The sound of his name on her lips caused a strange sensation in his chest. Mark realized he was stepping into dangerous territory. This woman intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain, and that was problematic for several reasons. First, she was his employee, which created a complicated power dynamic. Second, they came from completely different worlds. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he had sworn to himself that he would never get emotionally involved with anyone again. But as he watched her organize her cleaning cart with efficient movements, noticing how she checked every detail, how she treated each object with care, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in years, genuine curiosity about another person. "Victoria," he said when she finished organizing the supplies, "how long have you worked here?" 8 years, mister." "Mark," she replied, still clearly uncomfortable with the informality. "And do you like the job?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked if she liked the job. "It's an honest living," she replied diplomatically. Mark smiled slightly. That wasn't exactly an answer. Victoria looked at him for a moment, seeing something in his eyes that made her lower her guard slightly. "It's necessary. I have people who depend on me." Before Mark could respond, his cell phone rang. It was Gus, probably worried about his absence from the scheduled meeting. "I need to take this," he apologized. Hello, Gus?" Mr. Sterling, where are you? The meeting with the Japanese. Cancel everything for the rest of the morning, Mark said, surprising himself. I'm at the Grand Plaza resolving the complaint issue personally. Reschedule the meetings for after lunch. When he hung up, Victoria was looking at him with a curious expression.
Trouble?
She asked, momentarily forgetting the hierarchical distance. Nothing that can't wait, Mark replied, noticing how he liked the genuine concern in her voice. So where do we start this inspection? Victoria nodded, but her phone also rang at that moment. It was a number she recognized immediately, the hospital where her grandmother had her medical follow-ups. Excuse me, she murmured, answering with her heart pounding. Hello, Ms. Ramos? This is from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Your grandmother, Mercedes Ramos, was admitted here an hour ago. She took ill and... The phone slipped from Victoria's hand, her face paling completely. Mark reacted instinctively, grabbing her arm when she faltered. What's wrong? He asked, alarmed. My grandma, Victoria whispered, tears already starting to well up. She's in the hospital. I need to go now. Mark didn't hesitate for even a second. He took Victoria by the arm gently but firmly and said, I'll take you to the hospital. No, sir, I can't. Victoria tried to protest, still in shock. You have your meetings, your important appointments. I can take the bus. Victoria. Mark's voice was firm but surprisingly gentle. That's not a suggestion. It's a decision. He was already grabbing his cell phone. Gus, I need my driver to come to the Grand Plaza immediately and cancel all my appointments for the rest of the day. Mr. Sterling, but the Japanese investors. Gus's voice leaked through the phone. Not today. Mark hung up and turned to Victoria, who was standing looking lost. Get your things. Let's go. During the ride in the elevator, Victoria was trying to process what was happening. The most powerful man she knew had cancelled million-dollar meetings to take her to the hospital. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Why are you doing this? She asked in a low voice when they got into the limousine waiting for them at the service entrance. Mark studied her for a moment before answering. Because it's what you do for people you care about. But you don't know me, Victoria whispered, wiping away the tears that insisted on flowing. I know enough. Mark leaned forward and said to the driver, Northwestern Memorial Hospital, quickly but carefully. During the ride, Victoria couldn't keep quiet. The words came out in a nervous stream, as if she needed to fill the silence so she wouldn't think about the worst. She raised me after my parents died, she said, looking out the window. I was 17, my siblings were little. Joey was 8, Marie just 5. Social services wanted to separate us, put each one in a different family, but my grandma fought for us. She said that family doesn't separate, even if it meant going without. Mark listened in silence, beginning to understand the strength that was behind that seemingly fragile woman. She has diabetes, Victoria continued, her voice trembling. And her heart isn't doing well, but she never complains, never talks about the pain. She worked doing sewing at home until her fingers couldn't hold the needle right anymore. Now she can only make some crochet items to sell at the neighborhood fair. She turned to Mark, her eyes shining with tears. If I lose her... You won't lose her, Mark said with a conviction that surprised them both. Not if she's as strong as she seems to be. How can you know? Mark was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Victoria hadn't noticed before. Because I recognize strength when I see it. My mother was like that too. Victoria realized that he had said was in the past tense. What happened to her? Mark looked out the window, lost in memories that clearly hurt. Cancer, when I was 22. He paused. She fought for 2 years. Never complained, never gave up, even when we all knew there was no more hope. I'm sorry, Victoria said softly. She made me promise one thing, Mark continued, as if the words were coming out against his will, that I would never let money make me forget who I really was. That I would always remember where I came from. Victoria studied him with new curiosity. Where did you come from? Mark smiled bitterly. The south side of Chicago. My dad was a mechanic, my mom a cleaning lady. The shock on Victoria's face made him continue. Surprised? The first company I bought was with borrowed money, using my parents' house as collateral. If it had gone wrong, they would have lost everything. But it worked out, Victoria said in a low voice. It did. But the price... Mark stopped talking, realizing he was revealing too much about himself to a woman he had met only a few hours ago. Sorry, I don't know why I'm telling you this. Sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers, Victoria said gently. They don't judge us based on what they already know about us. When they arrived at the hospital, Mark insisted on accompanying her. Victoria was too nervous to protest vehemently, and secretly grateful for not having to face that moment alone. In the emergency room, they discovered that Mercedes had had a diabetic crisis and a cardiac arrhythmia, but that she was stable. The doctor, Dr. Thompson, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, explained the situation. She'll be fine, but she needs to stay in the hospital for observation for a few days. And he hesitated, looking at Victoria with compassion. She's going to need some special care from now on, more expensive medications, regular appointments with a cardiologist. Victoria felt the floor collapse beneath her feet. She could barely afford her grandmother's current medications, let alone specialized treatments. But before she could respond, Mark stepped forward. Money is no problem, he said calmly. She'll have the best treatment available. Mark, no! Victoria turned to him, mortified. I can't accept that. You can and you will, Mark replied firmly. Dr. Thompson, transfer Ms. Mercedes to a private room. I want her to have the best specialists available. Sir, the doctor began, clearly surprised by the turn of events. Mark Sterling. Mark introduced himself, handing over a card. Anything she needs, you can contact me directly. After the doctor walked away to make the arrangements, Victoria turned to Mark, torn between gratitude and despair. Why are you doing all this for me? She asked, her voice breaking. I'm nobody to you. I'm just a housekeeper you met this morning. Mark looked into her eyes, and Victoria saw something there that made her tremble inside. You saved my life today. You treated me like a regular human being when I needed it most. And now, he hesitated as if the next words were dangerous. Now I can't imagine letting you face this alone. Mark, besides, he said, trying to return to a lighter tone, you still owe me a complete inspection of the hotel. You can't get rid of me that easily. Victoria almost smiled, despite everything. You're impossible. I am, Mark agreed. But I'm impossible with good intentions. When they were finally able to see Mercedes, the elderly woman was awake and lucid, although pale. Her eyes, however, shone with curiosity when she saw Victoria enter, accompanied by an elegant man who clearly wasn't from the same world as them. Grandma, Victoria approached the bed, taking her grandmother's wrinkled hand. How are you feeling? Better now that you're here, my dear, Mercedes replied, but her eyes were fixed on Mark. And who is your friend? Victoria blushed, not knowing how to explain. He brought me here. Mark approached the bed respectfully. Ms. Mercedes, I'm Mark. It's an honor to meet you. Mercedes studied his face for a long moment. Mark, she repeated slowly. You have sad eyes, boy. Just like my Victoria's when she was little. She squeezed her granddaughter's hand. But you seem like a good man. Mark felt inexplicably touched by the elderly woman's simple observation. I hope to deserve that impression, ma'am. We'll see, Mercedes said with a weak smile. Time always shows who people really are. The following days became an unexpected routine for both of them. Mark insisted on paying for a medical leave for Victoria so she could accompany her grandmother's recovery without financial worries. Every morning, he showed up at the hospital with fresh coffee and croissants from an expensive French bakery, claiming that he was just passing by, an obvious lie, since the hospital was on the opposite side of the city from any of his appointments. Victoria tried to protest several times, but Mark was stubborn, and Mercedes had visibly become attached to him. The elderly woman seemed to blossom in his presence, telling old stories and asking questions that Mark answered with surprising patience. He likes you, Mercedes said to Victoria one afternoon when Mark had left to take an urgent call. And you like him too, "Grandma, don't be ridiculous," Victoria replied, arranging the flowers that Mark had brought for the third time that week. "He's just being kind. We're from completely different worlds. The heart doesn't understand differences, my dear," Mercedes said wisely. "But be careful. Powerful men can be dangerous, even when they have good intentions." On the fifth night, Mercedes had a relapse. The monitors triggered alarms in the middle of the night, and Victoria was called urgently. When she arrived at the hospital, she found Mark already there, still in his suit, as if he had come straight from some social event. "How did you know?" asked Victoria, running down the hallway beside him towards the ICU. "The hospital has my number as an alternate contact," Mark replied, without mentioning that he had specifically asked to be notified about any change in Mercedes's condition. "The doctors are with her now. They spent the night in the waiting room." Mark had dismissed his driver, saying that he would stay as long as necessary. Victoria was too tense to sleep, pacing nervously around the small space, while Mark watched her with growing concern. "Sit down," he said gently around 3 in the morning. "You'll wear yourself out before you even know how she is." "I can't," Victoria murmured, running her hands through her disheveled hair. "If she dies, if I lose her—" Her voice failed, and the tears she had been holding back all night finally began to fall. Mark got up immediately and, without thinking about the consequences, pulled her into his arms. Victoria should have pulled away, should have maintained the professional distance, but she was too exhausted to resist. She let herself be enveloped by the embrace, feeling for the first time in weeks that she wasn't alone, carrying all the weight of the world. "She's not going to die," Mark murmured against her hair. "She's too strong. Just like you." Victoria sobbed against his chest, feeling the warmth of his expensive shirt, the masculine scent of his cologne. "I'm so scared," she confessed. "She's all I have left. If she's gone—" "You're not alone," Mark said, and there was an intensity in his voice that made Victoria lift her face to look at him. "Not while I'm here." They were too close, their faces just inches apart. Victoria could see the small wrinkles around his eyes, the stubble that was starting to grow, the vulnerability that he rarely let show. Mark saw the tears on her dark eyelashes, the strength that radiated from her even in her moment of greatest weakness, the natural beauty that she didn't even know she possessed. "Mark," she whispered, not knowing exactly what she wanted to say. He raised his hand, touching her face with a gentleness that made her tremble. "Victoria, Family Ramos?" The doctor's voice separated them abruptly. Victoria jumped away from Mark, blushing furiously, while Dr. Thompson entered the room with a tired but relieved expression. "How is she?" Victoria asked, trying to compose herself. "Stable. It was a more serious arrhythmia, but we were able to control it. She will need to stay a few more days for observation, but the worst is over." Victoria collapsed into a chair, the relief almost physical. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, a touch that was intended to be comforting, but sent an electric current through both of them. "Can I see her?" Victoria asked. "Just for a minute." "She's sedated but stable." When Victoria entered the ICU room, Mark stayed in the waiting room, running his hands through his hair. What had almost happened there? He had been seconds away from kissing her, and the worst part was that she didn't seem to have resisted the idea. This was dangerous, very dangerous. She was his employee. They came from completely different worlds, and he had sworn to himself that he would never get emotionally involved with anyone again. But when Victoria returned, with red eyes but finally calm, Mark knew it was too late to back down. Dangerous or not, he was falling in love with her. "Thank you," she said softly, stopping in front of him. "For everything. I don't know how I'm going to be able to repay you." "You don't need to repay me anything," Mark interrupted. "Victoria, He stopped, seeing the exhaustion on her face. "Let me take you home." During the ride, both remained silent, but it was a silence charged with tension and unspoken possibilities. When they arrived at the address Victoria had given, a small 2-story house in a working-class neighborhood, Mark insisted on accompanying her to the door. "Victoria," he said when she turned to say goodbye, The way his name sounded on her lips made something flip in her stomach. "What happened tonight?" "Nothing happened," she said quickly, but her eyes said otherwise. "Yes, it did." Mark took a step closer. "And you know it." Victoria backed up until her back touched the door. "Mark, we can't. I work for you. We're different worlds, I know." He placed a hand on the door next to her face, leaning closer. "But that doesn't change what we're feeling." "I'm not feeling anything," Victoria lied, but her breathing was accelerated. "Liar," Mark murmured, his eyes fixed on hers. "Your eyes give you away, Victoria. They always have." For a moment it seemed like he was really going to kiss her. Victoria found herself holding her breath, her body completely betraying her words. But then Mark pulled away, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "You're right," he said, stepping back. "This is crazy, sorry." But when Mark got home, his hands were still shaking. And when Victoria entered her small and simple room, she could still feel the warmth of his body, the scent of his cologne, the intensity of his dark eyes. What neither of them knew was that across the street, inside a dark car, a man with a professional camera had recorded every moment of the goodbye. The photos of the country's most coveted tycoon on the doorstep of an unknown woman's house in the middle of the night would be worth a fortune in the tabloids. And the next morning, when Gus called Mark with a frantic voice saying, "Sir, we have a problem. The photos are in all the papers," Mark knew that the consequences he had tried to avoid had finally arrived. "Ernie?" Mark hung up the phone and rushed to the living room of his penthouse, where several newspapers were spread out on the coffee table. The headlines screamed in bold letters, "Tycoon caught with mysterious woman, Mark Sterling has new love. Who is the billionaire's new girlfriend?" The photos were too clear. Victoria at her doorstep, him leaning over her, the obvious intimacy between the two. The press had done their homework quickly. They already knew her full name, where she worked, her family situation. One of the smaller photos showed Victoria entering the hospital with the speculative caption, "Did romance begin during family emergency?" Gus entered the room unceremoniously, carrying more newspapers and his tablet. "Sir, it's worse than we imagined. The gossip websites are going crazy. I've already gotten calls from ABC, CBS, NBC. Everyone wants a statement." "What about my family?" Mark asked, although he already knew the answer. "Your Aunt Carol called 3 times. She's, how can I say, hysterical." Gus hesitated. "And there's more. Richard Vanderbilt called." Mark felt his blood run cold. Richard Vanderbilt was one of the most powerful men in the country, owner of a media empire and former partner of his father. More importantly, he was the father of Isabella Vanderbilt, the woman whom all of high society expected Mark to marry for years. "What did he say?" "That he needs to talk to you urgently. Something about mutual interests and hasty decisions." Gus paused. "Sir, does Miss Victoria know about the photos?" Mark looked at the clock. It was only 7 in the morning. Victoria probably hadn't seen them yet. Maybe he could get to her before. "Get the car ready now," but Mark arrived too late. When he rang the doorbell of Victoria's house, it was Joey, her 23-year-old brother, who answered. The young man looked at Mark with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Are you the guy in the photos?" he asked directly. "Yes, where's Victoria?" "Crying in her room," Joey replied sharply. "Ever since the neighbors started knocking on the door at 6 in the morning, wanting to know if it was true." Mark felt a pang of guilt. "Can I talk to her?" "I don't know if she wants to talk to you." "Joey!" Victoria's voice came from the stairs. She descended slowly, and Mark felt his heart clench when he saw her. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her face pale. In her hands she held some of the newspapers. "It's okay. Let him in." Joey hesitated but obeyed his sister. Victoria led Mark to the small living room where Marie, 22, was sitting with a cup of coffee in her hands, clearly tense. "So it's true?" Marie asked, studying Mark. "You're really Mark Sterling?" "I am," Mark replied, but his eyes were fixed on Victoria. "Victoria, I'm so sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "How was it supposed to happen?" Victoria asked, her voice sounding tired. You knew this would happen eventually, didn't you? Men like you don't stay with women like me without causing a scandal. Victoria, look at this. She raised one of the tabloids. The headline read, "The Cinderella of Cleaning. Has love conquered the tycoon's heart of stone?" They call me Cinderella, as if I were some pathetic fairy tale. Mark approached, but she stepped back. People in the neighborhood are talking. The neighbors are whispering. I can't even go to the bakery without being looked at like I'm a circus freak. This will pass, Mark said, although he wasn't sure. Will it? Victoria let out a bitter laugh. Mark, you live in that world. I don't. I don't know how to deal with photographers, with speculation, with people analyzing my every move. She sat down heavily on the worn-out sofa. And my grandma? How am I going to explain to a 72-year-old woman that her granddaughter is in the papers as the mystery girlfriend of a billionaire? Mark's cell phone rang. It was Gus again, Mark answered quickly. Sir, Richard Vanderbilt is here at the office. He said he's not leaving until he talks to you. Mark looked at Victoria, who watched the call with a resigned expression. I'll be there in an hour. And sir, Isabella Vanderbilt is here too. Mark closed his eyes. Of course she was. Tell them to wait. When he hung up, Victoria was watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Who's Isabella? She asked. Mark hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. And acquaintance. Mark. Victoria stood up, crossing her arms. Who is Isabella? Someone my family would like me to marry, he admitted reluctantly. Victoria felt like she had been punched in the stomach. I see. Victoria, it's not what you're thinking. There's never been anything between us. It's just a family expectation, a kind of social arrangement that's never interested me. But now you're going to have to deal with it, aren't you? Victoria said, her voice becoming firmer. Along with the press, with your family, with your whole life that I've complicated just by existing. You haven't complicated anything. No. Victoria picked up another newspaper from the table. Mark Sterling, From the Elite to the Housekeeper. Is it love or a midlife crisis? She threw the newspaper on the floor. I'm being portrayed as an opportunist or as your amusement. And you're being portrayed as a man who's lost his mind. Mark tried to approach again, but Victoria shook her head. No, listen, Mark. You've been kind to me, kinder than anyone has ever been. You helped me when I needed it most, and I'm grateful for that. But this, she gestured towards the newspapers, this isn't life. Not for me. Victoria, you can't give up on us because of gossip. I'm not giving up on us, she said softly. I'm being realistic. You have responsibilities, commitments, a whole world that expects certain things from you. And I have my grandma to take care of, my siblings, a simple life that doesn't include camera flashes and speculation about my motives. Mark's phone rang again. This time it was a number he recognized immediately, his Aunt Carol. Mark! The shrill voice echoed through the phone, loud enough for Victoria to hear. Have you completely lost your mind? A housekeeper, Mark. After everything your family has built? Mark hung up immediately, but the damage was done. Victoria had heard every word. Go, she said calmly. You have an important meeting, important people waiting for you. Victoria, please. She headed to the door. I need to go to the hospital to see my grandma, and you need to sort out your life. When Mark left, Victoria leaned against the closed door and finally allowed the tears to fall freely. Outside, she could hear the expensive engine of his car driving away, taking him back to the world where he belonged. What she didn't see was the car that remained parked across the street, nor the man with the camera who had recorded every moment of the discussion through the living room window. The photos of the argument, of Victoria's tears, of Mark's dramatic exit, were already being sent to the newsrooms of the country's leading gossip outlets. And at Sterling Enterprises, Richard Vanderbilt waited with Isabella by his side, an offer that Mark couldn't easily refuse, and an ultimatum that would make any relationship with Victoria not only inconvenient, but potentially destructive to everything he had built. The trap was set, and Victoria had become unknowingly a pawn in a game much larger and more dangerous than she could ever imagine. When Mark arrived at his office, he found Richard Vanderbilt pacing back and forth in his office as if he owned the place. Isabella was sitting elegantly in an armchair, impeccable as always, her long legs crossed and a cold smile on her lips. "Finally," Richard said, turning to Mark, "I thought we'd have to wait for you to resolve this whole embarrassing situation." "Richard?" Mark greeted coldly. "Isabella?" He walked to his desk, making it clear who was in charge there. "If you've come for a social call, this isn't a good time." "We didn't come for pleasantries," Richard replied, throwing a folder on Mark's desk. "We came to talk about business and the future." Mark opened the folder and felt his blood run cold. There were photographs, dozens of them. Him and Victoria at the hospital, at her house. Intimate moments that seemed much more compromising than they really were. But what shocked him were the last photos. Victoria talking to a man he immediately recognized as Ryan Sullivan, an investigative journalist known for his devastating reports on public figures. "Interesting, don't you think?" Isabella said, her honeyed voice carrying venom. "It seems your friend has been talking to very interesting people." "This doesn't mean anything," Mark said, but his voice sounded less convinced than he would have liked. "Doesn't it?" Richard approached the desk. "Ryan Sullivan doesn't talk to anyone without a reason, Mark, and he certainly doesn't talk to housekeepers about the weather." He pointed to one of the photos where Victoria was accepting an envelope from the journalist's hands. "It seems someone is being very well paid for intimate information." Mark studied the photo, his heart sinking. The image clearly showed Victoria receiving money, her expression serious, almost conspiratorial. "There must be an explanation." "Of course there is." Isabella stood up gracefully. "The explanation is that you've been manipulated, dear Mark. A desperate woman, a sick grandmother, expensive medical bills. It was easy for her to get close to you and get material for a devastating report. The report comes out tomorrow," Richard continued relentlessly. "Unless, of course, we come to an agreement." Mark looked at the two with growing understanding. "What kind of agreement?" "Simple," Richard smiled coldly. "You publicly announce your engagement to Isabella, a beautiful love story that has been cultivated for years, interrupted only by this brief confusion. In exchange, we make this report disappear, and your little housekeeper doesn't face lawsuits for defamation, invasion of privacy, and blackmail. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow, the entire country will know how Mark Sterling was deceived by an opportunist who sold intimate details of his life to the press," Isabella said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "Your reputation will be in tatters, your stocks will plummet, and your international investors will reconsider all the contracts." Mark looked at the photos again. Victoria really seemed to be conspiring with the journalist. But there was something wrong, something that didn't fit with the woman he knew. "Why should I believe you?" Richard picked up his cell phone and activated the speakerphone. The recording that followed was like a dagger to Mark's heart. "How much do you need?" The voice was clearly Victoria's. 50,000 should cover the medical bills for a few months, Ryan Sullivan's voice replied. "In exchange, I need everything. How he acts in private, what he says about business, intimate details." "He trusts me," Victoria said in the recording, her voice sounding calculating. "He thinks I'm innocent, that I really love him. He doesn't suspect a thing." "Perfect. Keep up that facade for a few more weeks. I need enough material for a series of reports." Mark felt the world collapse around him. The recording continued, with Victoria detailing conversations they had had, revealing information about his family, his fears, his vulnerabilities. Everything he had shared with her in moments of intimacy was being sold. "Enough?" Richard turned off the recording. "You have 2 hours to decide, Mark. The engagement will be announced this afternoon, or the report comes out first thing tomorrow morning." When the two left, Mark was alone in his office, looking at the photos scattered on his desk. The betrayal hurt more than he ever imagined was possible. Victoria had planned everything from the beginning. The accident at the hotel, the concern for her grandmother, the tears, the moments of apparent vulnerability. It had all been an elaborate act. 2 hours later, Mark was at Victoria's doorstep, the photos and the recording in a folder in his hands. He needed to hear her admit it in person. He needed to see in her eyes that it had all been a lie. Victoria answered the door, surprised to see him. "Mark, I thought you were resolving your situation with Isabella." Mark interrupted, his voice icy. "Yes, I resolved it." He entered uninvited, throwing the folder on the living room table. "I've resolved other things too." Victoria looked at the folder with growing alarm. "Mark, what is this? Why don't you tell me?" Mark opened the folder, scattering the photos. "Or better yet, why don't you listen to this?" He activated the recording on his cell phone. As Victoria's words echoed through the room, he watched her face pale completely. "Mark, I can explain," she began when the recording ended. "Explain?" Mark laughed bitterly. "Explain how you manipulated me from day one, how you pretended to care about me while selling every word I said." "It's not like that." Victoria despaired, trying to approach, but Mark stepped back. "You don't understand. He contacted me. He said he knew about us, that he was going to publish terrible things about you anyway. I just tried what? To protect me?" Mark picked up one of the photos showing her receiving the money. $50,000, Victoria. Was that the price of my trust? My grandma was dying." Victoria cried, tears flowing freely. "He said he could help, that if I collaborated, he would write a softer story that wouldn't destroy you completely." "Liar!" Mark exploded. "I heard every word. You said that I trusted you, that I thought you really loved me. Was it all a lie?" Victoria stopped talking, realizing how her words in the recording had sounded. On the recording, she sounded cold, calculating, when in reality she was desperate, trying to protect him in the only way she knew how. "Do you really believe that I would do that?" she asked in a low voice. "After everything we've been through together, do you really think I would be capable of— What am I supposed to believe?" Mark shouted back. "The evidence or the word of a woman who clearly lied to me from day one?" Victoria felt as if she had been physically struck. The pain in his voice, the contempt in his eyes. It was worse than anything she had ever felt. "Get out of my house," she said calmly, wiping away the tears. "Victoria, get out!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Go to your Isabella, go to your perfect world, where people like me don't exist. Where people like me don't complicate your perfect life with our dirty problems." Mark hesitated for a moment, seeing the raw pain in her eyes. For a split second, he questioned if he had been manipulated in another way. But then he remembered the recording, Victoria's cold words, the money changing hands. "You're right," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Our worlds are different, and I should have remembered that before letting myself be fooled." When Mark left, Victoria collapsed on the living room floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Outside, more camera flashes recorded his dramatic exit. 3 hours later, all the television channels announced the surprise engagement between Mark Sterling and Isabella Vanderbilt, described as the wedding of the century in high society. And in Victoria's simple house, she was still on the living room floor, surrounded by the photos that showed the only truly happy moments of her life, moments that now seemed to have been built on lies on both sides. Their love was dead, buried under real and perceived betrayals, under worlds that should never have met. 2 weeks had passed since Mark had left her house, and Victoria could barely recognize herself in the mirror. She had lost weight, her clothes seemed too big, and there were dark circles under her eyes that not even the little makeup she owned could hide. Mercedes had been discharged from the hospital and was now resting at home, but even the joy of having her grandmother back couldn't pull Victoria out of the deep depression she had plunged into. The newspapers continued to speculate about Mark's failed romance and redemptive engagement, painting her as the opportunist who had tried to take advantage of the tycoon. "Victoria, you need to eat something," Marie said, entering the room with a tray of food that she knew would be rejected, like all the others. "I'm not hungry," Victoria murmured from her place on the bed, where she spent most of her days since returning to work at the hotel. Management had been understanding enough not to fire her, but had transferred her to the graveyard shift, cleaning empty offices where she wouldn't run the risk of encountering important guests. Vicky! Joey's voice came from the door. There's someone here to see you. Victoria sighed. Probably another journalist trying to get a statement, or maybe some curious neighbor. Tell them I'm not here. I think you'll want to talk to him, Joey insisted. It's Gus, Mark's assistant. Victoria sat up in bed immediately, her heart racing. Gus, why would he be there? Had Mark changed his mind? Had he finally realized that? She walked down the stairs with trembling legs, finding Gus in the living room, visibly uncomfortable in the simple surroundings. He stood up when he saw her, and Victoria was shocked by his appearance. The always impeccable man looked exhausted, worried. Ms. Victoria, he said formally, I need to talk to you. In private, Victoria nodded for Joey and Marie to leave, although she could sense that they were still listening behind the kitchen door. If you've come to ask me not to talk to the press, you can rest assured, Victoria said, sitting on the sofa. I have nothing to say. It's not that. Gus sat on the edge of the armchair, leaning forward. Miss Victoria, I need to tell you some things. Things that I've discovered in the last few days and that... He hesitated. That could change everything. Victoria looked at him distrustfully. What do you mean? Gus took an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. First, I need you to understand that I'm risking my job, my career, maybe even my safety by being here. Gus, you're scaring me. You should be scared, he replied grimly. Richard Vanderbilt and Isabella set a trap for you both. A very well-crafted trap. Victoria's heart began to beat faster. What do you mean? Gus opened the envelope and took out some photographs. These are photos of the man who pretended to be Ryan Sullivan with you. He showed a photo of a man that Victoria recognized immediately. It was indeed the journalist who had approached her. This is the real Ryan Sullivan. He showed another photo of a completely different man. The one who spoke with you was an actor hired by Richard Vanderbilt. Victoria took the photos with trembling hands. I don't understand. The recording they made you listen to was also fake. They took your voice from phone calls. Did you know that some hotel lines are monitored for training purposes? And created a montage. Gus took out a small digital recorder. I have the original recording here. Do you want to hear it? With her heart in her throat, Victoria nodded. Gus pressed play and she heard her own voice, but the context was completely different. The phrases were out of order, cut and pasted from different conversations. What in the montage sounded like admission of manipulation, in reality were fragments of innocent conversations rearranged maliciously. My God, Victoria whispered, tears beginning to fall. Why did they do this? Because Richard wanted to force Mark to marry Isabella. There's a gigantic financial agreement at stake. Merger of companies, international contracts, billions of dollars. Gus put away the recorder. You were just an obstacle that needed to be removed. Victoria stood up abruptly, pacing around the room. Does Mark know about this? No, and that's the problem. Gus also stood up. Ms. Victoria, Mark is destroyed. He really believed that he loved you, and to believe that he was betrayed in this way. He's not the same man. Then tell him the truth. I tried, but Richard has people everywhere. My access to Mark is limited and... Gus lowered his voice. I've received some very clear threats about what would happen if I said too much. Victoria stopped pacing, facing him. Threats. Richard Vanderbilt is a powerful and dangerous man. He's not going to allow anything to get in the way of his plans. Gus looked nervously out the window. The wedding is scheduled for the day after tomorrow. An intimate ceremony only for family and close friends. After that, it will be too late. The day after tomorrow. Victoria felt the panic taking over her. But how can I prove anything? It's just your word against theirs. Not just my word. Gus smiled for the first time since he arrived. I got this. He took a flash drive from his pocket. Recordings of some conversations between Richard and Isabella, planning the whole trap, and financial documents showing the payments made to the fake journalist. Victoria took the flash drive as if it were the most precious object in the world. Why are you doing this? Risking everything for me? Gus was silent for a moment. I've worked for Mark for 10 years. I've seen him build an empire. I've seen him become one of the most powerful men in the country. But I never saw him happy until he met you. In the last 2 weeks, I've seen him wither, become a shadow of what he was." He sighed. "And because I know that you really love him, that was obvious to anyone who had eyes. But how am I going to make him believe me after everything that's happened?" "I don't know," Gus admitted. "But I know that if we don't try, he's going to marry Isabella the day after tomorrow and be unhappy for the rest of his life. And you," he studied her, "you'll never forgive yourself for not having fought." Victoria looked at the flash drive in her hands, feeling for the first time in weeks a spark of hope and determination. "Where is the wedding going to be?" "At the Vanderbilt's estate in the Hamptons. Maximum security, hand-picked guests." Gus paused. "It will be impossible to get in there." Victoria raised her chin, and Gus saw a glimmer in her eyes that wasn't there when he arrived. "We'll see." When Gus left, Joey and Marie rushed into the living room. "We heard everything," Joey said. "Vicky, are you going to fight for him?" Victoria looked at her siblings, then at the staircase where she knew Mercedes was resting, finally understanding what her grandmother had taught her all her life, that family fights for family, that true love is worth any battle, and that sometimes the weakest person needs to be the bravest. "I am," she said, her voice firm for the first time in weeks. "But I'm going to need help." Marie smiled. "You have 2 people who would do anything for you, and a grandmother who will want to participate in the plan." Mercedes' voice came from the top of the stairs. The elderly woman was descending slowly, but her eyes shone with determination. "After all, if we're going to save the man I love like a grandson, we better do it right." Victoria looked at her family, her true wealth, and for the first time since Mark had left her house, she smiled. They had no money, no influence, no power, but they had something that Richard Vanderbilt and Isabella didn't expect. They had true love, and they were willing to fight for it. The wedding would be in 24 hours. And Victoria Ramos, the housekeeper who considered herself unworthy of a tycoon's love, was about to prove that true love was more powerful than any conspiracy. The Vanderbilt's estate in the Hamptons was decorated with understated elegance for what the newspapers were already calling the wedding of the century. Guests from New York high society arrived in luxurious cars, all eager to witness the union that would solidify one of the largest financial empires in the country. Mark was in the room that had been assigned to him, adjusting his tuxedo tie for the 5th time. His eyes in the mirror reflected a man who had aged years in just 2 weeks. Gus had tried to talk to him several times, but Richard maintained a tight control over who had access to the groom. "It's almost time." Richard entered the room without knocking, followed by 2 security guards that Mark had noticed always hanging around in recent days. "Isabella is radiant. You're a lucky man." Mark didn't answer, just kept looking at his reflection. In a few hours, he would be married to a woman he didn't love, living a life he didn't want, but at least he would be protected from the public humiliation that Richard had promised if he backed out. "Mark," Richard approached, placing a possessive hand on the young man's shoulder. "I hope you've learned your lesson about getting involved with unsuitable people." "The lesson that I should never trust anyone?" Mark asked bitterly. "I've learned it." Meanwhile, a mile away, Victoria was parking the old Civic borrowed from a neighbor on a dirt road that led to the back of the property. She had spent the night studying floor plans of the estate that Joey had found online, looking for a way to enter without being detected by the security guards. "Are you sure about this, Vicky?" Marie asked, holding her sister's hand. If this goes wrong, at least I'll know I tried," Victoria replied, checking one last time the flash drive in her purse. "Joey, are you sure you can hack the sound system?" "Trust me. 3 years of computer engineering are good for something." Joey smiled nervously. "But you're going to have to get to the mixer in the main hall. And I'll be at the entrance, creating a distraction," Marie added. "Mum would be proud of us." Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. "Mum would be proud of you for helping me fight for love." They hugged quickly, and Victoria set off on the path in the woods that would lead to the main house. Her feet knew the forest floor. She had grown up running through places like that as a child. The simple dress she had chosen, the only really nice one she owned, allowed her to move easily. At the house, the ceremony was about to begin. The guests were settling into the main hall, decorated with expensive white flowers and crystal chandeliers. Isabella was stunning in a wedding dress that cost more than Victoria earned in 5 years, but her cold eyes contradicted the radiant smile. "Dear friends," the officiant began, "we are gathered here to unite in marriage Mark Sterling and Isabella Vanderbilt." At that moment, Victoria managed to enter through the kitchen, taking advantage of the rush of employees. No one paid attention to the woman in the simple dress who seemed to belong to the service staff. She found her way to the main hall, where she could see Mark from behind, next to Isabella on the makeshift altar. Her heart broke as she saw him. Even from a distance, she could perceive the stiffness in his shoulders, the lack of joy that should characterize a happy groom. This wasn't the man she had known, the man who had fallen in love with her. This was a defeated man, fulfilling an obligation. Victoria located the sound system and headed towards it, keeping to the shadows. Her hands were trembling as she connected the flash drive to the equipment. Outside, she could hear the first chords of the music that announced Marie's entrance as a late guest, creating the necessary distraction. "Mark Sterling," the officiant's voice echoed through the hall. "Do you take Isabella Vanderbilt to be your wife, to love and cherish her, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Mark opened his mouth, but before he could answer, his own voice filled the hall, but it wasn't the words everyone expected to hear. "What am I supposed to believe? The evidence or the word of a woman who clearly lied to me from day one?" It was the recording of the day he had confronted Victoria, but it continued with something that no one present had heard before, Richard Vanderbilt's voice. "Perfect, Mark. Exactly the reaction we expected." The recording you heard was a montage, of course. We hired an actor to impersonate the journalist. We edited Victoria's lines from phone conversations at the hotel. But you believed every word, didn't you? The silence in the hall was deafening. Mark turned slowly, his face paling as he understood what he was hearing. The recording continued with Isabella's voice. "Dad, you're a genius. Mark never suspected that we were manipulating everything from the beginning. The poor little housekeeper really thought she was protecting him when she talked to our actor. Turn that off." Richard screamed, gesturing frantically to the security guards. But Joey had programmed the system to repeat the recording in a loop, and it ricocheted through all the speakers on the property. The best part, Richard's voice continued on the recording, was seeing how he destroyed himself from the inside, believing that he had been betrayed by the only woman who truly loved him. Mark stepped away from Isabella as if she were radioactive, his eyes searching frantically for the source of the recording. That's when he saw Victoria emerging from the shadows at the back of the hall, her simple dress contrasting with all the opulence around her, but her eyes shining with a determination that he had forgotten how much he loved. "Victoria," he whispered, his voice carrying years of regret in a single word. "Security guards!" Richard bellowed. "Arrest that woman. She's trespassing on private property." But the guests were in an uproar, all talking at the same time, some trying to understand what was happening, others already recording videos with their cell phones. The recording still played, revealing every sordid detail of the conspiracy. Mark began to walk towards Victoria, but Isabella grabbed his arm. "Mark, darling, this is clearly a hoax. She's trying to destroy us." "Us?" Mark pulled away sharply. "There is no us, Isabella. There never was." He looked at her with a mixture of disgust and pity. "You destroyed the only good thing I had in my life. Mark, you don't, and Victoria Ramos, the housekeeper who considered herself unworthy of a tycoon's love, was about to prove that true love was more powerful than any conspiracy." "You can't believe this." Richard tried to block his path, but Mark simply shoved him aside. Victoria was standing in the middle of the hall now, surrounded by chaos, but with her eyes fixed only on Mark. When he stopped in front of her, she could see the tears he was trying to hold back. "You came back," he said simply. "I never left," Victoria replied, her voice firm despite the tears that ran down her face. "You're the one who walked away." Mark raised his hand, touching her face, as if he didn't believe she was really there. "Victoria, I'm so sorry." "I know," she whispered. "I was sorry too, but now we know the truth. Enough." Richard had managed to turn off the sound system and was now walking furiously towards them, flanked by security guards. "This farce has lasted long enough. Arrest that trespasser and throw her off my property." Mark immediately stepped in front of Victoria. "No one is going to touch her." "Mark, be sensible," Richard tried one last gambit. "Think about your reputation, about your business. Are you going to throw it all away for a housekeeper?" Mark looked around the hall, at the shocked guests, at Isabella, who was crying tears of anger and humiliation, at Richard, who glared at him with barely disguised hatred. Then he turned to Victoria, the woman who had overcome a conspiracy, trespassed on private property, and risked everything to save him from a marriage that would destroy him. "My reputation?" Mark smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he had given in weeks. "Richard, my reputation has never been better." He turned to the guests, raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Victoria Ramos, the bravest, most honorable, and most extraordinary woman I have ever met. And if you think that she's unsuitable for me because of her profession or background, then you're wrong." He took Victoria's hands in his. "I'm the one who's unsuitable for her. She risked everything to save me from myself, while I abandoned her at the first sign of trouble." "Mark," Victoria began, but he shook his head. "Victoria Ramos," he said, kneeling right there in the middle of the chaos, in front of all the shocked guests. "Will you marry me? For real this time? For love, without manipulation or hidden agendas?" Victoria looked down at the man she loved kneeling at her feet, and then at the hundreds of people who were watching them in absolute silence. For a moment, she felt intimidated by the scrutiny, by the glaring difference between their worlds. But then she remembered her grandmother's words, "The heart doesn't understand differences," and she remembered her own courage, which had brought her this far. "Yes," she said, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, Mark, I will." The hall exploded in applause. Not all the guests, but many of them, touched by the genuine demonstration of love they had witnessed. Mark stood up and kissed her right there, a kiss that erased all the hurts, all the doubts, all the differences that had tried to separate them. When they broke apart, Victoria saw Joey and Marie running towards them, followed by Mercedes, who had managed to arrive at the estate at the last moment. Her family, her true wealth, running to embrace them. "What now?" Victoria asked, looking around the still uproarious hall, where Richard was gesturing furiously on the phone and Isabella had disappeared, probably to cry in private. "Now," Mark said, interlacing his fingers with hers, "we go home. To our home." 6 months later, Victoria walked down the small chapel in Queens, where her parents had been married decades before. The dress was simple, borrowed from a cousin, but her smile was radiant. Mercedes, fully recovered and stronger than ever, walked her down the aisle where Mark was waiting for her, no longer as an impeccable tycoon, but as a man in love who had learned that true value isn't measured in money. The ceremony was simple, with only family and close friends. Gus was there as Mark's best man, and Victoria's siblings as her witnesses. But when the priest asked if Mark took Victoria to be his wife, his answer echoed through the small chapel with a conviction that no conspiracy could shake. "I do, forever." And when Victoria said, "I do," it was with the certainty that some fairy tales are real, not because they are easy, but because they are earned through the courage to fight for true love. Later, at the small party in the house they now shared, a simple house but full of love, Mark raised his glass for a toast. "To love that overcomes all differences," he said, looking into his wife's eyes. "And to the woman who taught me that true power doesn't come from how much you have, but from how much you are able to give." Victoria smiled, remembering the insecure girl who thought herself unworthy of a tycoon's love. That girl had grown, had fought, and had discovered that true love knows no social classes, doesn't understand differences of background, and that sometimes the richest person in the world can be the poorest in love, while the simplest can be the richest of all. And they lived not exactly happily ever after, because real life has its difficulties, but they lived loving forever, which in the end is much better than any fairy tale.